This is the story of my first magical summer in magical McCarthy. I had visited before as a kid because I grew up in Anchorage, Alaska, and that made me one of the only people who was working in McCarthy that summer who was actually from Alaska, and all of my coworkers at the Wrangell Mountain Center where I was an intern were from other states, so I was the token Alaskan. I thought that was pretty fun, but at the same time I was realizing that you have to be a lot more tough in McCarthy than you have to be in Anchorage, because you have to be able to, I had never showered with a bucket outside with mosquitoes biting me, and so I felt like some of my Alaskan street cred was like being undermined by having grown up in a big city. So I sort of wanted to prove myself as a true Alaskan, whatever that meant. And I was getting along really well with my coworkers. So when my dad invited me to go salmon fishing on the Copper River, I was excited to have a chance to prove to them that I do know how to fish at least. And the last thing I said to them as I left the Wrangell Mountain Center was, I'm gonna go provide for my new family. So I met my dad in Chitna, where we were gonna go dip netting on the Copper River. And if you don't know what dip netting is, it's something that only Alaska residents are allowed to do, and it involves a really big net that you have to put in the water to catch salmon. It's a really efficient way to catch a lot of fish and fill your freezer. So a lot of Alaskans rely on that for their food. And my family and I had always been dip netting on the Kenai River, where even though there's tons of people on the beach, everyone's really generous and really helpful. So if they see that you're trying to catch fish and it escapes, they're going to try to catch it for you and help you. And if they see that your spot isn't very good, you're not catching many fish, they're probably going to say, hey, let's switch, you can have this spot. And these are complete strangers. So I had really enjoyed fishing on the Kenai, and I was hoping that the Copper River would be the same. So we met up with a couple of my dad's friends who had been fishing on the Copper River before, and they were gonna make sure we could figure out where to go fishing, because on the Copper it's a little bit harder than the Kenai to find a good spot. So we followed them on a trail to the water, and with all of our gear, our coolers and our dip nets and our ropes to tie ourselves up on the bank so we didn't fall in, and we started fishing. So they found this good spot that I think they'd fished before, and pretty soon they'd caught 5 fish, and we hadn't caught any. And to me that was really surprising, because in my experience my dad had always been an expert fisherman, and I'd almost never seen him not catch any fish. He knew where they were, and he would get them. So I was like, what's going on here? And I thought the only conclusion was that the spot that these other people were fishing was much better than where we were fishing. So I was thinking, if we were on the Kenai, they would have offered to let us use their spot. But maybe they'd never been fishing on the Kenai. So that wasn't the case. And finally our net broke off in the water. I think it had caught a giant, really big boulder or something, and it just snapped. So we could no longer go fishing. We were like, okay, well, guess we'll have to leave. And these friends were like, oh, well, shucks, I'm sorry to hear that. Why don't you take one of our fish? And we were like, oh, thank you. But the whole time we were thinking, like, this would never happen on the Kenai. And we were like, I don't think we're going to go fishing with them again. So we trudged back to our cars, and my dad left me with the one salmon, and because he was going to catch more on the Kenai. So I drove the McCarthy Road with a cooler full of ice and a single salmon, and going through my head the whole drive was remembering talking to my coworkers, and the last thing I said to them was, I'm off to provide for my new family, and I wasn't going to be able to do that. I only had 1 fish to give them, and I hadn't even caught it. So I was very disappointed, and I sort of felt like my Alaskan skills were waning. This was supposed to prove myself as a true Alaskan, and here I was not catching a single fish. So a very, very sad drive, when all of a sudden in front of me I saw in the middle of the road a dead roadkill snowshoe hare. And maybe on other circumstances I would have been like, oh, that's too bad, poor thing. But this time, I stopped my car and I thought, that's food. I already had a cooler full of ice and only one fish in it, so I knew there was a lot of space. And I'd always kind of wanted to eat roadkill, but I've never done it. And so I got out of my car to check out the hair, and there were a few things I had to check. So I noticed that the eyes were clear. So far, so good. The only injuries that were visible were on the head and the legs, and you don't normally eat those parts anyway, so that was good. It was still warm. I touched it through my rubber gloves, and it also didn't have any rigor mortis. When I pulled on its legs, they were really flexible. So this was the perfect candidate for a meal. So I was like, okay, well, I wonder if my coworkers will be grossed out or impressed. And I figured if they were grossed out, I'd just throw it in McCarthy Creek or something. No big deal. I already had this cooler, so I put it in my cooler, and I drove back to the Wrangell Mountain Center. And when I came in to tell them what had happened, they were actually really impressed by the snowshoe hare, not grossed out. Maybe a little surprised, but impressed. So, after I learned on YouTube how to skin a rabbit, and I learned that there is more than one way to skin a rabbit, I went with my newfound knowledge to skin and butcher the rabbit along McCarthy Creek. So as I was doing that, these tourists were taking my picture, and I was really worried that they'd think it was gross too, but they didn't. They were like, wow, what a cool Alaskan scene. I was like, okay, good. Nobody thinks it's gross. I'm glad. And I was going to serve it for dinner that night, but all of a sudden it occurred to me that in a couple days, the college students in the Wilderness Field Studies program were going to be coming, and they were from all over the country, and maybe they would enjoy sharing this rabbit. So I waited until they arrived before serving it up, and as I chopped it into little pieces, I was a little disappointed that we wouldn't each get to try more of the rabbit. We only have a little bit. But as we were all eating our meal, and they were really excited and appreciative, I realized the power of generosity. You know, the earth had provided this very small bounty, and I was sharing it with all these people, and that was really special. That's when I realized that I had been a true Alaskan this whole time, because generosity is what makes a true Alaskan. Sometimes you're looking for a salmon, and the universe gives you a rabbit, and that's okay.